Well, Ken, thank you for taking the time. I appreciate it.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to be with you.
We'll talk a little bit about the midterms, 8 days until today. Then we'll know whether or not the Republican majority will maintain or will have a split Congress.
Right.
But what we'd like to talk to you about today also is the influence of money in politics, because you wrote a book about this, really good book about it, which also the Danes know about. So
Cool. Thank you.
well, at least we do. So we'll spread the word now. But
Excellent.
Ken, first things first, where are we? There's a week to go now. Where you see this going from now?
Well, Democrats certainly had the momentum, and it seemed like it was foregone that they would take at least one chamber, maybe both, in Congress. Interestingly, Donald Trump turned the conventional wisdom on its head. You know, the Democrats were doing well because the election was about Trump, was seen as a referendum on him, and he had mostly negative, sort of the perception of him was mostly negative in public opinion polls. And so the conventional wisdom in a situation like that is to try to localize the election for the party that's in power, that's on the defense, to try to make it a bunch of different local races. Instead, what Donald Trump did is really seize the mantle and embrace the idea that it was an election about him, and is trying to rally the Republican base to support Republican candidates because of their support for him. The Republicans have embraced this to some extent, and we do see some closure in the polls. Some of that is normal, so we don't know necessarily to what extent it is attributable to Donald Trump's really aggressive push on the campaign trail. But the idea that this is that the election results are going to overwhelmingly favor Democrats, I think, is being reconsidered somewhat now in the final stretch.
Right. Let's talk a little bit about what role money has played in the campaign so far, because we've seen records made by, for instance, Beto O'Rourke in Texas in terms of fundraising. But we also, when we talk to people on the streets, hear that that's one of the main reasons why they're so displeased with politics, because the influence of money is so huge. Let's start with that first, Ken. You wrote about this also in your book. How big a problem is the influence of money to the average American's feeling about whether or not the politician is actually there for them or for the big money?
People do, if you ask voters in opinion polls, they will tell you that they are frustrated and upset about the role of money in politics. But we've seen in the past, even as we've seen a greater amount of big money flooding into the process, we've seen that it is not a top voting issue for voters on either side. When they go into the polls, they will tend to vote more on issues related to the economy or to healthcare or even war and peace. And money in politics, or generally government good governance, falls somewhere below there in their list of priorities. That said, we do see a strong anti-establishment sentiment in the electorate. That was part of what powered Donald Trump in 2016. And those concerns about the establishment being sort of ignoring the concerns of the little guy and being just out to protect itself and people in power, those do kind of include concerns about money buying access and buying influence. And so what we've seen from a number of Democratic candidates, you mentioned Beto O'Rourke in Texas, there's countless House and Senate candidates across the country on the Democratic side who've tried to tap into that frustration with big money and saying, if you reject, telling their voters and supporters, if you reject the idea that very wealthy interests and deep-pocketed corporations that can afford to hire lobbyists should have a bigger voice than you should give me your money, your small donations. And we've seen Beto O'Rourke and some of these Democratic candidates really do a great job of tapping into that sentiment to raise record-shattering amounts of money from small donors, so that even though the net result is that there is still a ton of money flooding into this midterm election, and it appears on pace to shatter spending records, including the $5 billion threshold. If the money remains apace, it will be the first time that more than $5 billion with a B dollars have been spent in a midterm election. The change and the sort of flipping of the script is where the money is coming from. It's coming more from small donors than from big donors in this cycle.
Is this also a tendency you see going on after the midterm is done in terms of the 2020 election?
Absolutely. There is very much a divergence in approach on the Democratic side. The Republicans are still, they've always struggled to raise small money, and they're still trying to do it. Interestingly, Donald Trump, with that anti-establishment sentiment that we talked about, has been very good at raising small dollars, but Republicans have mostly lagged behind on the small dollar donor front and have tried to make up for that by raising huge sums of big money into super PACs and party committees. Well, on the left, we now see a real debate. The left has tried to raise big money as well, but has lagged behind there. And now on the left, we see a real debate headed into 2020 about whether candidates, prospective Democratic presidential candidates, will try to use money as an issue to separate themselves from others vying for the party's nomination and reject big money. And if they reject big money, how much of an advantage does that give them with small donors? Is it worth sort of keeping their distance from these major donors who have traditionally played a very big part and in the early stages of the nominating process? That was one of the things that we looked at to determine whether a candidate for the party, for either party's nomination, had a real chance, was which big donors do they have on their side. Well, maybe in 2020 we'll see some of the candidates renouncing the big donors and criticizing their opponents for raising big money. That, I think, is something that will shake out and maybe be a determinative issue in the early stages of the Democratic primary.
You mentioned now the super PACs. It's been a few years ago now since the Supreme Court decision about the Citizens United Act. How much of a game changer would you say that was to American campaigns and politics in general?
It certainly was up front, and in the few election cycles afterwards, we saw big money really playing a huge role in the way that I was just sort of alluding to, where it was critical for a presidential candidate and even Senate candidates, even some congressional candidates, to be able to have a supportive super PAC behind them that was able to raise these huge checks from major donors. And I think a lot of people thought, headed into 2016, that the primaries on both sides would be a story of big money. But we saw on the Republican side, Donald Trump turning that wisdom on that thinking on its head and running against those big donors, at least initially. Now it's important to point out that he has since then become very solicitous of these big donors and has embraced the super PAC and has had these big donors come into the White House to meet with him. But at least initially, he generated a lot of energy by running as a candidate who was sort of against big money in politics and against these big donors and would shake up the system. And same thing on the left. Even though Hillary Clinton was the candidate of big money and she had spent decades courting some of these major donors, she got a real scare from Bernie Sanders, who ran against the big money. And so, again, headed into 2020, we're going to see candidates like Bernie Sanders, maybe even Bernie Sanders, running campaigns that are against big money. And then we're going to have to see whether other candidates decide that maybe the big money is so important that it's worth it to take the hit in the sort of PR battle to allow my opponent to be able to cast me as the candidate of big money. Maybe the trade-off is worth it to be able to have that big money assisting my campaign.
Ken, just a final question, because I know you're a busy man, so we'll let you get back to breaking news upstairs. How big a role will the results of next Tuesday's midterm election have on the 2020 campaign as you see it?
Oh, it will be huge. If Democrats retake the House, and certainly if they retake both the House and the Senate, we're going to see just nonstop congressional investigations of Donald Trump and potentially even impeachment proceedings. Definitely, if Democrats retake the House, they're going to try to impeach Donald Trump and demand his taxes and the like. The question of the effectiveness of that will be whether they retake the Senate as well. Otherwise, it's just going to be Democrats sort of crying in the wilderness about and maybe making life difficult for the administration, but not necessarily impeaching the president. There is a risk when you talk to Democratic operatives about, or a concern that they might overstep and sort of turn off voters headed into 2020 by being seen as just exclusively adversarial and not having any ideas of their own. This is something that we saw in the 1990s with Bill Clinton. Republicans won big in his first midterm election. They retook Congress in 1994, and then they just went hard, they went hard at President Clinton for the next 2 years in a way that, in hindsight, historians believe may have helped Bill Clinton win re-election in 1996. Democrats are conscious of that, and some in the party are fearful of it. Others in the party, though, are so aggressively anti-Trump and animated by the energy that they see in their base against Donald Trump that it's going to be difficult for them to moderate the way in which they sort of proceed if they retake the Congress.
No doubt we'll be in for quite the evening next Tuesday. Thank you again for taking the time.
Thank you.